round 2. Fix this up. Okay, so now we spoke with Allison, speech therapist on the team. Now we're going to speak with Samantha Shepard. She's our pediatric-based physical therapist. So same questions as with Allison, but obviously different answers since we all are different disciplines. So first, tell us a little bit about physical therapy. What has your career looked like up to this point? What are you currently doing? And then why did you choose PT?
I've been a PT for 2 years. I first started as an acute care therapist. And then after COVID, I kind of transitioned out of that into pediatrics. I always wanted to do pediatrics, but it's kind of hard to get into as a new grad. So now I'm here and slowly transitioning to more full-time over here.
Yes, that's what we're striving for. So why did you get into physical therapy? What sparked that interest?
I was always in sports growing up, and I was in physical therapy a few times as a kid for hip and knee problems. And I really just fell in love with how the body works. And I knew I wanted to do something to help people, so I kind of put 2 and 2 together, and here we are.
Did you ever think in school you would do peds?
In undergrad, no, but in grad school, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. So in class, I have a majority of my class is headed to grad school to do speech therapy. But we also have some like early development, education, early intervention experience as well. So we've talked a lot about interprofessionalism, interdisciplinary teams, different service models, and what works well for certain settings, because not every model works for every setting. So unique that you could speak to acute care as well as outpatient, but who are some other professionals that you work with on a daily basis?
Well, obviously I work with occupational therapists and speech therapists, both here at pediatrics and in the hospital. And then more so in the hospital, I work very closely with nurses, physicians, social workers, case managers. Those are probably the most people I interact with. Respiratory therapists.
Rehab tech.
Trying
to think of like who all goes in a room.
I know, yeah. Those are probably the most that I work with like every day.
Yeah. So kind of to, I guess, talk about more of a unique thing, could you give an example or talk about a time in acute care, maybe with COVID and all of that, that you had to particularly work very closely with another team member?
Yeah, so during COVID, at one point our whole unit shut down and became a COVID unit. And myself and an occupational therapist were there pretty much 40 hours a week doing all kinds of stuff. And we worked really closely with one of the respiratory therapists, especially around like mealtime. He would go down the line and switch everybody over from their masks to something else that they could, quickly eat. And then Brooke and I would go down the line and help them eat. And then he would circle back around and kind of put everybody back on their original oxygen. So that was very interesting to work with him very closely.
Yeah. Allison kind of touched on that she feels like more in grad school, that big push for students to be learning a lot about interdisciplinary work what was your experience or what was your education in school? I guess previous knowledge before going into a set. Like, did you know that you were going to work with all these people?
I mean, they told us that, obviously you're going to have to talk to nurses, you're going to have to talk to doctors, but I don't think it really hit me until I did a couple of my rotations where it was like, you really had to communicate with them. But then I honestly didn't realize it was such a big deal until I came here, because it's such a small community and such a smaller hospital that is so much more valued here than it is, in Cleveland, where I did some
big
hospitals.
Yeah. So with all of your experience and in the different settings, why do you feel like interprofessionalism and interdisciplinary work is so important for quality of care?
Well, particularly in peds, I find it interesting to learn from not only occupational therapists but speech therapists on things that I have no idea about, like behaviors and different ways to, kind of manage those, and I would have no idea what to do. And then in the hospital, it's so much more valued because, everybody does different things with the patients. And, we may notice something that the doctors don't notice, or the nurses may notice something that we don't notice. And kind of putting all that together gets the patient the best care, usually.
Yeah. Well, and you have different roles on a team. So, like you said, you're doing different things with the patient. Like a doctor is not showering and bathing the patient, and you might notice something different, or they might say something that, hey, you're being showered, you feel really comfortable with this person who's helping you, I'm going to share this piece of information that maybe I didn't feel comfortable sharing when a doctor and a slew of med students came in.
Yeah.
So I think I always look at interdisciplinary work as you're complementing each other. So, I know you always say, like, OT, like, you put us with that, with behavior management, because it is something that we know a little bit more about based on our experience, whereas, it's been so long since I've done anatomy and that kind of stuff, but that is, like, your jam, and so I can come to you and be like, okay, they're sitting funny, like, what do you think's going on with their hips, or something like that, posture control, positioning, stuff like that. We actually, last week, our class, we talked about positioning and how important that is, and that would be something that, as you're working in a classroom or as you're working in a clinic, if you notice that the child that you're working with is not successful in doing some of the things that you want them to do because of their positioning, that would be a perfect opportunity that you would call in a physical therapist, where you would say, hey, can you come give me some advice? And I just always like that.
And I've
complementation.
I've had you guys too, and specifically like with Allison and you guys, that there's certain things that you guys are working on that I can also carry over to my session, especially with some of the younger ones that are like first learning how to talk and stuff. I've kind of learned how to help them figure that stuff out, so it kind of carries over both ways.
Absolutely, particularly if you have a kid that they're only coming once a week to any type of service. That 45 minutes with just one therapist is not going to change their world, but if it's being carried over into all settings, then you're going to see a lot more progress. So what would be some advice for students in undergrad or graduate school in regards to just interdisciplinary work exposure or just anything? What would be some advice?
My biggest piece of advice is do not have tunnel vision. A lot of kids or a lot of students in my graduate class, they only wanted to do outpatient ortho. And so that's all their rotations were. But, our teachers had preached to us to really mix it up. So I had rotations in acute care, outpatient, peds, and cancer rehab. And that was, because that's when you're going to learn the most. So that was the most eye-opening for me, was to try everything, and I didn't have tunnel vision, and I didn't limit myself when I was applying for jobs too.
Yeah, and I touched on in Allison's interview that sometimes those opportunities are not just required or not just given to you. You have to seek those out. And you kind of have to take that initiative to say, okay, I know I really want this, but I need to also learn and shadow and experience these things. Because sometimes your programs just aren't going to force you to do it. And then you get out in the real world and you're like, oh, there's no, I really want to live in this area and there's no jobs in that population that I want, and I'm going to have to service another population, but I've never even opened a book about them or anything like that. All right, so shifting gears a little bit from interdisciplinary and interprofessional work, we've also talked a lot about inclusion and inclusivity for specifically the pediatric populations in the classroom, in the community. What has been your experience, if any, with inclusion in any population, not just pediatrics?
I think it's hard because we live in such a rural area that, especially at the hospital too, patients aren't close to therapies. So it's even more pertinent for them to get the education in the hospital. And then same thing with peds. We live in such a very nature-driven environment that there's not a lot of opportunities for them to be included in things like sports and playgrounds and all that stuff.
And I think a big barrier for our adult population as well as our pediatric population is financial support. We treat a very, very high rate of Medicaid patients. And a lot of times that means, not always, but that means they're on a very fixed income. They have very limited financial resources. So not necessarily that Moorhead offers it, but things like equine therapy or aquatic therapy, something that you as a therapist would love to recommend because you think it would work great for this family. There's that limit of inclusion because of their like socioeconomic situation and status. So I think that's hard too. Now that you're in more of the peds world, why do you think it's important that kids are have accessibility and are able to be included in their community?
Because it's going to help them reach their goals more so than if they're just going to therapy at home and just staying at home. Right. You know, so many like normal kids, they learn so much in school and on the playground and with other kids, and if we don't have those things for these kids that are having difficulties, they're not going to get that same level of participation and learning.
Right. I think about like the spots in town that we like to go. I have a little boy, we take him with us, and I think about, okay, what if he had a wheelchair? Or what if he had a walker? Or just like endurance. I have to park far away and to go there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in Eastern Kentucky. Coming from a big city, like a bigger city, can you think of anything that you would love to see in like Moorhead have or around us?
I think probably more adaptions on playgrounds would be cool. When I did a rotation in Pittsburgh for pediatrics, and it was actually home health, but we would meet a lot of families at like playgrounds and stuff, and it was a lot of them were very easily accessible to any kid. And then I think aquatic therapy would be. So I did some aquatic therapy in one of my rotations, and it was very beneficial to the patients. And I think a lot of our hospital patients or even like outpatient adults would benefit from it.
Yeah. Well, any other comments or thoughts on inclusion or interdisciplinary work?
I think so.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. I'm sure they appreciate it. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.